Welcome everyone, I am Guadalupe Alione. I am the student caucus leader for the Non-Religion in the Complex Future project. So we are here today for a new installment of our series. Today, David Speed and Penny Edgell will discuss the recent article, Eternally Damned Yet Socially Conscious, the Volunteerism of Canadian Atheists, Sociology of Religion, 2023. Dr. David Speed is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of New Brunswick in St. John. He teaches Introduction to Psychology, conducting research, related statistics, and program evaluations. His primary interests are using layered datasets to explore religious groups. When David isn't teaching, researching, or avoiding administrative work, he enjoys spending time with his wife and 3 children. Penny Edgell, Ph.D. University of Chicago, is a cultural sociologist whose research focuses on religion, non-religion, and symbolic boundaries in the United States, examining religious effects on social and political attitudes, civic engagement, well-being, and social inclusion exclusion. She is the author of Religion and Family in a Changing Society and Congregations in Conflict, and her work has appeared in American Sociological Review, Sociology of Religion, Journal for Scientific Study of Religion, Poetics, Social Forces, and other journals. Currently a business scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation, working on a book about changes in American religion since the 1990s. Welcome again, David and Penny. I now the floor to do your presentation, and after your presentation, we'll have a Q&A, and I will be moderating for that. So, whenever you want.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here today. My name is Penny Edgell, as she said, and I did not do a PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk with you. How's that? I will just talk with you a little bit. So I've been interested in volunteering for a long time, but I'm not really I'm not one of those scholars who is a scholar of volunteering. I've been interested. I got interested in this topic because I was first studying religious communities, religious organizations, and one of the big questions in sociology of religion has been how religious organizations kind of draw people into civic involvement, political activity, voting behavior. There's a whole range of outcomes that people have studied, thinking about religious commitments as being a factor that shapes those outcomes in our social world. And so the original study that I did that probably that really focused specifically on volunteering was a study that used data from a research project in upstate New York. And we had a survey of community members in the same communities where we had also done a lot of research in these local congregations. And this paper just looked at the survey of community members, and we're looking at the factors that shape volunteering. And lo and behold, we did find that, religious commitment influences volunteering behavior. It leads people to volunteer. But we also found that it was really complicated. And the complications that we found echoed complications in the research more generally. So when you think about, well, what is it about maybe going to a church specifically or being a religious person? Those are slightly different things. The literature has looked at both. That might lead to volunteering. What's the link? And everyone kind of agrees that there are lots of different factors that can shape that relationship and that outcome. So first of all, there are properties of individuals, right? So does the person have a particular religious identity or some other religious identity? The specific religious identity you embrace has been shown to influence your volunteering. Does the person hold specific religious beliefs? But then there are other features of the individual that really don't have anything to do with religion that also shape volunteering. So the amount of time a person has, whether other kinds of commitments, is a person employed full-time, part-time? Does a person work overtime? Does a person have a long commute? There are other features of individual life. Does somebody have children or not? Are you a parent with children in the home? That influences your volunteering. So you can kind of think of the individual as a nexus of a lot of different factors that might shape volunteering behavior. And some of those have to do with religious commitments and membership in a religious organization. And then when you think about what religious organizations might bring to the table, how they might foster volunteering, there's not really... It's not just a single story in the literature. It's about, well, churches do a lot of different things. They, first of all, churches really differ a lot in the formal kinds of volunteering opportunities they provide. To read the volunteering literature quickly, you might think, oh, all these churches are offering all these community programs and people just show up on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night, and they just kind of get plugged in. But churches really differ on that. Quite a few smaller churches don't do anything really like that at all. But all churches provide the opportunity to simply get to know other people who also tend to live in your community or other communities around, people who might themselves be involved in various volunteer efforts. And, people talk and you kind of get to know about things because you're in this community of people that meets together every week, and you get to know these other folks and you get drawn into the things that they get drawn into. So I did this early study, and I found that in the communities I was looking at, there was kind of this intersection that there were particular kinds of congregations that were more likely to foster volunteering among their members, and that was kind of the piece of it that we contributed to. And then I didn't, think about it very much for several years, and then I got to Minnesota, and I was working with Jackie Frost, and she and I started to talk. And she raised a very good point, which is that if you think about religious effects on volunteering, then everybody else who is not religious is just kind of lumped together into a reference category. And when you think about it, that's not actually a very sensible approach, because I just sat here and walked you through all of the various complicated factors that might link religious behavior or religious beliefs or religious commitments to volunteering. Why would we think that everyone else is just one big uniform mass, that they all have something in common, that there isn't complication there too and variation? So we decided to check. We had data from a national survey from the American Mosaic Project. And it didn't have a ton of measures of volunteering or community engagement, but we had a few. We had a measure of whether you volunteered or not. We had a measure of whether you had spent time participating in a range of community organizations. So we were interested in civic involvement more generally, but one of the measures was volunteering. And so we ran analyses, and we again found, some of the same things you find in every study, like personal characteristics matter. Personal characteristics make people more or less likely to engage with their community in a variety of ways that have nothing to do with religion or non-religion. But we also found out that when you break out different kinds of non-religious people, you find that amongst some of them, their rates of volunteering are just as high as the rates of volunteering are for people who identify as religious. And in particular, we found that atheists were just as likely to volunteer as were religious folks. And so what I took away from that study was the need to disaggregate different varieties of non-religious belief and experience to see if we really want to understand, as we do with religious effects on volunteering, if we really want to understand kind of the complex factors that might shape the tendency to volunteer for non-religious people as well. And when you do that, and this is, I think, where the study with David came into play, and where I was so excited to have a chance to collaborate with David on this. When you do that, one of the things it lets you do is it lets you kind of take a step back and say, well, is there anything unique about either being an atheist or about being religious in terms of beliefs? Is it really just about that really shapes your inclination to volunteer? Or is it really mostly, is this a story about the opportunities that we have as we go through our social world? And as everyone here probably knows, religion is characterized in the United States by just being super organized. Like there are lots and lots. I mean, I'm living in in Manhattan for a year. I'm on a fellowship. I'm very lucky. It's wonderful. But and I don't think of this as a particularly religious environment, big city, urban. But you can't walk 5 minutes without stumbling across a church here, right? I can walk for hours without stumbling across anything that seems obviously to be an organization devoted to atheism or non-religion or agnosticism. I'm sure some of them are there. They're not visible on the street. They're not as common. So there's also just this question of one thing we do know is really different when it comes to comparing people who are not religious to people who are religious, is just this organizational infrastructure that facilitates religious identity formation, religious belief, religious practices, the passing on of religious traditions. So it makes sense that just opportunities might be a big part of the story. And with that, I will turn our presentation over to David, who will walk you through what we actually found and why this opportunity issue came to be so important.
All right. Thank you so much, Penny. I'm going to do a lot more ums and ahs than you've had. So generally, there is, for the people who aren't Canadian, there's something called Statistics Canada, which is our federal data collection agency. StatsCan has this really cool thing is when they collect data, they'll make it publicly available to people who are interested in it. And because I'm very lazy as an individual, I like using StatCan data because I don't have to collect my own data. And sometimes I'll kind of peruse the data sets to see what type of variables are available. And it turns out there's quite a lot. And one day I kind of stumbled upon volunteering ones. I had recently read a paper by Frost and Edgell, which is what Penny had referenced. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? I wonder if there would be any interest in collaborating and kind of harnessing this expertise for volunteerism with this really, really interesting data set. And the really cool thing about StatCan is that they collect a lot of different options for religious identity. So within the NORC data set for the GSS done through the University of Chicago, there's maybe 13 possible denominations. They just recently added a variable that allows you to distinguish yourself as like atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular, or other none. But StatCan has nowadays, I think, like 160 religious affiliations you can identify as, which is just like bonkers in terms of the variability. And what I realized is looking at the data is that, well, we've got this really cool opportunity to actually investigate if atheists differ meaningfully from other religious affiliations. I'm not saying atheism is a religion, but you can classify it in kind of as a religious affiliation and kind of investigate whether or not, atheists are perhaps less pro-social, because this is kind of the tired canard that gets dragged out about, the detriments of secularism. So after some back and forth with Penny, we got a basic idea together. We talked about our hypotheses, and we were off to the respective races. And the really cool thing about StatCan is that they use different variables sometimes to measure the same thing in order to conform to international standards. And StatCan had a collection of volunteering questions, which included, have you volunteered in this capacity or this capacity? What types of organizations do you volunteer for? How many hours do you spend volunteering? So this is really, really rich data. And after getting some contracts signed with StatCan so I could access their data set and promise not to reveal anything super secret, I was able to go into like a secure facility and then start our analyses. And our initial draft of our analyses, to be honest, it was really, really cool. So when we're looking at atheists and we're comparing, we compare atheists to non-atheists with respect to volunteering, our initial modeling showed that atheists have this huge volunteering advantage. So this is like the first draft of our paper. And this was like shocking to me because I wasn't expecting that atheists would have this really, really large advantage. And it turns out that the reason why this is happening is the vast majority of people who identify as religious don't volunteer. And a bigger chunk of atheists, people who identify as atheists, they do volunteer. So we were kind of confused by this. And one of the reviewers suggested we parse out the effect of volunteering by looking at whether or not it's affected by other variables like prayer or, say, attendance. So, maybe we should delineate across someone who identifies as religious versus someone who identifies to religious and like goes to church every week or something to that effect. And this is a really, really good suggestion. Like, the peer review process is criticized, but sometimes it's really helpful. And this really allowed us to kind of dive in deep to the data and kind of do these point-by-point comparisons between atheists and non-atheists with respect to their volunteering probability across varying levels of prayer and religious attendance. So when we're looking at these data, we can see that when we're comparing atheists who generally have very, very low levels of religious attendance, very, very low levels of prayer, and we can compare them against people who are religiously affiliated and also have really, really low levels of attendance or prayer, atheists hands down out-volunteer them. Like hands down out-volunteer them. However, when you compare atheists on basically any volunteering metric against people who are, we're going to call them super religious, they go to church all the time or they pray every day, atheists tend to be out-volunteered by that group of people, by that very select group of people. Now, you might think, well, how big is that group? Well, here's the fun fact. Through kind of trial and error, I was, in the windowless room doing the analysis. None of this is Penny's fault if there's any mistakes. What we found is that if you filter out people based on whether or not they go to church all the time and pray every day, you lose about 90-ish% of everyone identifying as like a given religious affiliation. So you're like the perception of like, religiosity, I say someone's religious, you might think of, you may have the stereotype of like fire and brimstone or very, very devout. No, the vast majority of religious people or people who identify as like religious, they are not involved in like religious ceremony. They don't seem to be praying a lot. You're losing a huge percentage. Now there's some variation. It might be between 80, I think 85-ish% in some cases. But if you're looking for belief behavior consistency, people who are non-religious much more likely to report, I don't go to church, I don't pray, at a greater degree of belief behavior consistency. So that's really kind of interesting. Anyway, so when we're looking at the results and we kind of start comparing atheists at low levels of religiosity or low levels of attendance, and we start comparing them against other groups with low level of attendance, we find that we get this parity. Like there's an equality across the amount of volunteering for the religious groups, but atheists out volunteer them. It's kind of flipped when we compare them against the high levels of religious attendance. Atheists are out volunteered in that case. Well, that's okay. Like that kind of makes sense. As Penny was saying, there's like an opportunistic, there's opportunistic things for which to volunteer. If you're going to church on a regular basis or mosque or synagogue, and someone says, hey, we're running a soup kitchen, you're going to hear about the soup kitchen. You might be kind of like subtly pressured or suggested that we're going to do this thing, you should volunteer for it. Okay, well, this really accounts, this is really an explanation that accounts for that opportunity argument. So people who go to church a lot, they're more likely to volunteer. But surely people who are praying all the time, they've got to have that level of devotion or sincerity. So we would expect that there's a greater inclination to go volunteer because someone is specifically religious. Well, what happens when we compare like the people who pray a lot versus the people who don't pray a lot? What do we find? Well, in that case, the results don't really emerge in the same way. Prayer is this weaker predictor of whether or not someone's inclined to volunteer or will volunteer. So it's really interesting that in a more general parlance, like an extrinsic religiosity is more predictive of whether or not someone will engage in that volunteering behavior, whereas an intrinsic religiosity is far less predictive of that. And so what we ended up doing after as like a type of a follow-up analysis is we looked at the type of things people could volunteer for. So there's like a wide range of things that StatCan collected data on. And some of the things they collected data on is like, okay, well, you said you volunteer. What type of organization are you volunteering for? And there's a huge number of options. So just kind of give you an idea. You could say you're volunteering for culture and recreation, education and research, health, social services, environment, development and housing, law or advocacy, philanthropic intermediaries, international organizations, religion, and some sort of business or professional thing. So there's 11 categories that we could pick. These broadly align with international standards. I think the international standards had 15 instead. But we chose this because I could fit that into a table and it made sense with the context of what we're talking about. And what's really interesting is that generally when you do see differences between atheists and non-atheists in terms of volunteering patterns, atheists are more likely to volunteer for the variety of anything other than religion. But when you're comparing religious individuals, the thing that they're volunteering for, they're not going to PTA, as like an example, they're volunteering for a church. They're not going to do an advocacy thing. They're volunteering for their church. And Penny really had this like wonderful piece in the discussion where she's contrasting the difference between bridging and bonding social capital and like the implication that this would have when we're talking about how religion's pro-social. Religion's acting pro-social insofar that it is a bonding social capital where people are affiliated together, they're doing things together, but unless you're part of that immediate community, you may not really see that benefit. Like a soup kitchen benefits everyone, sure, but the type of volunteering would also include like, are you going to be an usher? Are you going to be an elder? Are you going to help with like parking? Are you going to host an event or a raffle for the church? Those may not necessarily have the same broad implications for the community as like, say, the PTA would, or volunteering to help coach hockey or whatever. Penny, was there anything else you wanted to add? Because I feel like.
No, I think you hit the nail exactly on the head. I think that the research, I think the specific findings are interesting. I think that it makes a lot of sense, right? That the volunteer opportunities that you have, if you're going to a religious organization, often involve supporting that religious organization, right? That makes a lot of sense. I do think that there are larger implications, though, for for just the general narratives that we tell, the stories that we tell. I sometimes think that people who are not, I see this on Twitter all the time. I am on Twitter. I don't really tweet that much. But I find Twitter just fascinating for all kinds of reasons. And I've been pretty able to curate my feed so that I don't have a lot of problematic things in my feed. And plus I almost never post, so nobody's angry at me, so I don't, so it works for me. But I do think Twitter is this one of these spaces where we tell stories about what the data mean. And there are lots of people out there who, that's why they're on Twitter or these other public forums. They want to be the one telling the story. They don't want to be poor David stuck in the windowless room, really doing the hard-hitting analysis, right? They want to step back and say, oh, here's what this means. They want to be the interpreters. And the interpreters tell a story that is much bigger than the data on every particular, study that we find. And the interpreters are interested in these big stories, and they're really interested in stories that say that religion is pro-social. And again, it's not necessarily that that's not true, but that's such a big term that it allows people to collapse a lot of different things into that one term. So there's pro-social in terms of I'm going to get out of my house and interact with other people and participate in a group where we all share something in common. That is pro-social. As a woman who's working at home today and completely content can tell you, right? That's pro-social. But there's also pro-social in terms of being altruistic, of being concerned for the well-being of the broader community, of caring about people who are not exactly like you. And the story there is really not supported that that this is one of the things that's going on when religion draws people into, when religious commitments draw people into volunteering. So yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it, is we, just with a caution about taking very specific findings from very specific studies, which people have very painstakingly set up to be precise and to really be sure that they found what they found. And then we really need to be cautious about taking that step back and just interpreting the whole world as being relevant to that particular finding.
That was great. Thank you so much, David and Penny. Super interesting. So I want to open now the floor for questions. You can either, open your mic and say the question yourself, or you can write it on the chat and I will read it. So please go ahead and let's start the discussion. Ryan, please go ahead.
Sorry, I always have questions. Thank you, Penny and David. It's good to see you both. Love the paper. This is awesome stuff. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm just going to start with one. Hopefully other people have questions too. So it's kind of a weird question, but do atheists have a preferred area or kind of type of volunteering that they actually do, right? So obviously it's not religion, but you listed 11 possible categories. Where are they actually doing most of their volunteering, or is it all of those, just not religion?
So I'll tackle this one, Ryan. So great to see you. So it doesn't really fit a specific pattern. It's just basically anything but religion, which makes a ton of sense. I mean, if someone wants to find fault, oh, atheists aren't volunteering at churches, fight me, fine. But generally speaking, the things where we see the difference, I think this is in table 4 for the paper, is you don't really see any consistent pattern. Just as an example, atheists are more likely than Muslims to volunteer in a culture and recreation place. Hold on, making sure I got that right. I'm pretty sure it's more likely in that case. They're more likely than, say, agnostics to volunteer in a health organization. But these are really just kind of sporadic one-off types of things. I can't think of any theoretical reasons why atheists would be more likely to volunteer than every religion in every area. There tends just to be a lot of parity, and just kind of just kind of dipping back to my own research, because my specializations in religion and health, with the narrative so long of there is a health advantage, or there's some advantage to being religious, religion's pro-social, there's some advantage of being pro-social, being religious. I think just at this point, tying, seeing the dialogue around hey, there's no difference. I think that's a huge win for not necessarily promoting secularism, but for ensuring that secularism is well represented, fairly represented in the context of communication and in academic reporting. in a sense, we're not playing for a win. We're just playing not to lose, because there's just been so much like narrative around how atheists and agnostics, they're somehow like, they don't fit with society, which I think is absurd.
Sorry, Nathan, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the really interesting presentation. One thing I wanted to ask about is like the kind of the idea about like social desirability of certain things. Like I wonder, like the people who obviously, if you say you volunteer a ton each week, it's kind of like a socially desirable thing to do. But is there any way to know, how accurate people self-report their own volunteering? And this in the same way, I guess, the same with church attendance or amount of prayer and so on. So I wonder if that comes up, or if like, the accuracy of self-reports or things like that.
Penny, do you know anything about like self-report bias in the context of volunteerism?
That's a great question. I know that there used to be a sense there used to be studies back in like, oh my gosh, when I was in grad school, so that would have been the 90s, and right after that, that we're looking at desirability bias in terms of reporting church attendance. And there was this famous study. It was like 3 people went out and like they counted all the people in a particular county and like the churches on a Sunday morning, and then they compared it with self-reported rates, the data that they'd broken down by county. It was exhausting, but it was kind of proved the point. It's like, look, we're getting like self-reported rates that are much higher than like just the numbers of people in the pews. There's something wrong here. But the problem, I think, with knowing what that means today is that church attendance rates have just fallen off the cliff, along with all other measures of religious involvement since about 1990 is when it started, and it just picked up speed and it just kept going. So I don't know today. I think to me, it's an open question today whether or not there is a social desirability bias toward reporting that you attend church. I don't know if there's been any research on volunteering. I think that's a fascinating question. We all assume that volunteering is a positive thing, so we assume that there would be, we being researchers, I think that there would be maybe a social desirability bias there, but I'm actually not sure. I mean, I think that a lot of people who think about it. You're a parent, you've got kids, you work a full-time job, your partner works a full-time job. Are you really sitting around feeling guilty that you don't have yet more time to give to some cause? I mean, I just don't know. I mean, I think it's possible that people feel guilty if they're not doing this, but but I'm really not sure. I think it would be a really interesting thing to study.
Great, thank you for that. I see there is a question by Elizabeth in the chat. Did you find an overarching trend reason as to why atheists volunteer, thinking about how religious identifying people might cite religious values or morals as a part of the reason for volunteering?
So this was something that like the data weren't equipped to answer, because it's like not a qualitative thing. With that being said, let me give you my opinion about this as enthusiastically as possible. So we have a section in our paper called like atheism as a signifier. So it's not particularly like within the past 10 years, like becoming or being an atheist is more socially acceptable than it was like 50 years ago. There's still some degree of stigmatization. People going out of their way to identify as an atheist isn't, or in my belief, probably isn't just signifying a non-belief in God. They're probably signifying something more. This kind of atheism plus dialogue that you have, or dialogue in the United States, where it's, yeah, I'm an atheist, but I'm an atheist and I want to accomplish or do certain things. Generally, the type of organizations that atheists will do, just as an example, like the atheist community of Austin had like initiatives to do stuff with the homeless. We know that there's, I think, Secularism Canada or Humanist Canada, they'll do various initiatives to ensure like access to healthcare. So there tends to be like a liberal skewing almost with atheism, which makes sense in the context of how historically there's been oppressive elements within conservative movements with respect to religious non-belief. And I think part of that like liberal skewing is that you want to make the world a better place. And that just happens, let's, do advocacy work, let's go help out, and let's go ensure that we have a say in our future and what's going to be happening in society. Like once atheist mobilization started happening, like the mid 2000s ish, where out and proud sort of thing in the context of atheism, I think there was like an uptick in the willingness to do and be seen doing these pro-social things, because it's signifying that like atheists are like, valued members of the community and are willing to do things and help out the community. We're not like, or they're not the boogeymen, so to speak.
I would agree with that. And I also think that it is not to be overlooked the fact that many atheists have an active critique of the role of religion in society. And they also have an active critique of things that they see as that they understand as harms, right, perpetuated particularly by conservative religious groups. So that might be a motivation to become involved in a campaign for LGBTQ plus rights, right? Or it might be I'm thinking of one particular action network in Minnesota. We have a religious activist network too, or kind of a faith-based network. We used to be PICO affiliated. I don't know if they still are PICO or some other organization, but there's a secular one as well. That's really, I mean, if you look at the list of things they're active in, it's like everything against the kind of conservative political stances, some of which have been religiously informed, right? So they were way back when Minnesota several years ago was pushing for same-sex marriage. This group was right there, front and center. When it comes to lobbying for driver's licenses for illegal immigrants, right, or so that people can get ID, right there. So I do think that there is a sense in which there are things that atheist people might want to mobilize around. And yeah, they do, I think, tend to be progressive causes, but they tend to be also pretty specifically kind of pushing back against things that they see as maybe the harmful effects of religious influences, particularly in the United States and particularly on the religious right in public life. And that wouldn't be the same in all contexts, I think, either. And I don't know that it's always been the same in this context.
I also just, I had thought of this after Penny had started speaking. I think there may also be, if you're identifying as an atheist, you've likely been presented at some point with some sort of like apologist approach of, basically, I ran an atheism kiosk when I was going to grad school because I'm just a curmudgeon. And a good chunk
of was
it
a Kiss Me, I'm Atheist? You have to tell us if it was.
No, it was some of the stuff we'll talk about next time we chat in person, or we grab a beer together. But it was one section I had for a poster was like, common arguments against atheism. And the one that, well-meaning, well-intentioned people bring up is like, like, how can you be good or moral without like, God telling you what to do? And this is always a fascinating critique for me, because it's kind of like telling on yourself. Penduletti's the entertainer, kind of outspoken atheist. He said, like, I've murdered as many people as I wanted today, and that was 0 because I think murder is a bad thing. And so it's kind of the same idea, is that if someone's identifying as an atheist, they've likely been exposed to like apologetics about why, or perhaps counter apologetics in some cases, why this is a problem. Well, they've probably identified, well, no, morally, I think that this is right. I think this is important. So there's probably perhaps a greater degree of like thinking out and like kind of building a philosophy of why something is good, as opposed to being told like murder is bad because God says it's bad, saying, well, murder violates the wellness principle, and if we have to really consider like how society, it's a much more in-depth, rigorous philosophical examination in some cases, maybe. So that may also be like a motivating factor for why atheist individuals volunteer.
Mm-hmm. I think it's fascinating. Can I just say one more thing? I think it's a fascinating question because there used to be this really old book by Theda Skocpol called The Joiners. And her thing was just like, if you want to explain like differences between people, don't forget like this fundamental social fact that, some people are joiners and some people aren't. Right. And so joiners tend to join lots of things, and they join churches, but they also join other things, and they join. And right up until fairly recently, there hasn't been a lot of an option for, if you're an atheist and you're a joiner, there were a lot of things to join based on that. But there are other things to join, right? There are other, and it may well be, and Theda Skocpol, I don't think her book talks about this, but I've always had this question of whether or not this tendency to want to join things, or to be open to joining things, to be a joiner, if that operates at both a symbolic level and a practical level. So maybe it's the case that people are just willing to identify as something specific are also likely to be joiners. I don't know that that's true. I mean, I'm like way out. This is pure speculation. But I think versus people who just don't think about things like that as much and are just, oriented in that way. I don't know if that's true, but if part of I'm a joiner means, in effect, I'm a person who constitutes my sense of who I am by banding together with other people who are like me in some sense to do stuff. Maybe that means you're also more likely to pick a specific identity and identify with that and think of yourself as that. And now that I think about it, that might be like an idea for a research project. I've never seen that explored, but I just think it's an interesting question. That might be why we tend to think about identity certainty and identity saliency as things which affect people's behavior, but that we tend to approach that in our discipline, I think, from a pretty psychological perspective, right? And I guess to me, I'm thinking about it more as a sociological phenomenon. I'm a person who marks who I am based on either group-based activities or group-based identities.
Great.
If anyone knows any
Thanks,
research on that, let me know.
Yeah.
I literally have never had that thought before, but I think it's interesting to think through.
I agree. Oh, I don't know if there is any other question. I do have a question myself. Oh, I see there is a question. Just ask you my question and then I will read Lauren's question. I wonder if Statistics Canada, how they conceptualize volunteering and if they make a distinction between volunteering and activism, or if activism is kind of included in volunteering. How is that conceptualized?
Oh, that's a good question. Hold on. So generally, based on my recollection of approximately 2 years ago, so take it with a grain of salt, they listed a really long or a large number of activities that a person could theoretically be involved with in order to constitute a volunteering type of behavior. And what, oh, that's weird. My computer's freezing up. But what they basically did though was they had like, do you help people out in a paid or in an unpaid context? It could be, some sort of like, helping out family, you're helping out non-family, you're helping an organization. It should theoretically include activism as well, because it's still a form of volunteerism. So if atheists are more socially active, this might explain it, but it would also imply that atheists are deliberately involving themselves with like organizations that are like doing volunteer work. So like, I'm not really sure though. I don't think there's anything precluding it. It would encompass it. But atheists, like Penny was saying, like it's more difficult to find organizations that are explicitly devoted to secularism, but you might find something that's like cause-based, like an environmental group. You might be able to find something like that. I'm not sure though.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks, David. So I'm going to read Lauren's question in the chat. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the decision to represent inclination with your prayer. Did you consider other activities or factors, or was play just a clear, obvious choice? I was also thinking about donations. Do you know if there is any research on non-religious influences on monetary donations? For instance, teething, a collection plate in church or religiously affiliated hospital versus secular charities.
So in terms of other nations, Penny probably would be more equipped to deal with that question. So Penny, take it away if you want.
Okay. Okay. Oh, no, this is about, donations. No, there, I do not believe, first of all, yes, there is research on factors that shape how much money people give in terms of donations to various altruistic causes. There is even some research that sorts out religious giving versus other forms of philanthropic giving. I know that the research exists. I don't know what it says, but that should be findable. There is a fairly robust stream of research on kind of charitable giving and I do know at least some of that research compares religious and non-religious folks. I am going way off of a very distant and dim memory, but I think that it's going to be fairly close. I think it's going to probably echo what David and I found, which is that people who are religiously committed give money to religious causes.
Yeah, my grad student and I were just starting a project. Ryan Cragen is in the chat, is also involved in it. But we're going to be using a similar data set to this to actually look at charitable donations, kind of using a similar approach that Penny and I use for the volunteering. And again, like the same underlying logic can be used as well. Like, is it just, religious people are super generous because that's like, a religious imperative, or is it, you're going to church all the time and like there's tithing and that's considered a very voluntary charitable donation. So there is, if there's not a lot of stuff now in Canada, there will be something hopefully within the next year or so. And with respect to the question with inclination with prayer, this is more of a limitation of the GSS than something specific that there's more of a limitation. So one of the really cool things about StatCan data is you get 15, 20,000 observations, huge amount of religious variability, but the type of religious questions they'll have, they're not always as diverse as within the American GSS. The questions we had access to were religious attendance and religious prayer, perhaps not ideal, but not terrible either as an indicator for inclination. I think Penny and I discussed it for a bit, and I think we basically was like, this is a fair representation of what we're trying to do. Although, I think we put in a limitation sections that one of the challenges of using secondary data is that you're going to get, a restriction on what types of questions you can answer.
Yeah, and I mean, it is an indicator that's a little bit better for like non-Christian groups also engage in prayer. Like some of the indicators that you need an indicator that's a reasonable candidate for any particular religious person, right? And prayer seemed to be, at least on that kind of at that level, it's not a bad indicator. But yeah, there just weren't a lot of other measures.
Please, Ryan, go ahead. I can see you raising.
Yeah, so kind of a tricky question. It's a bit of a two-parter. I'm wondering, one, if there are other variables that are related to volunteering, and I'm in particular thinking about, there was for this long time, this understanding that people who attend religious services more often were healthier, right? Which I know David is like freaking out right now, and I get that. But part of that, right, was the causal direction was all messed up, right? So like you can't pull that out. So I'm wondering if like health is related to volunteering. I'm wondering if you threw that into the models. So I'm kind of interested in that. And then the second part of that question is, were you able to determine what percentage of the variation in volunteering is accounted for by being an atheist? Right. So I'm kind of looking at like the magnitude of the effect. So clearly atheists stand out, right, in some ways, but how much of the volunteering, like how much of the variation in volunteering, and it may be that it doesn't work and like this just doesn't make sense, but I'm just kind of wondering, like, if I know that somebody's an atheist, is that going to tell me like how well can I predict that they're going to volunteer type question? Sorry, hard questions.
So there were a variety of things that predicted volunteering, and what I'm doing right now is just pulling up the original regression model that we had. There's always space constraints, and there's always about 30 things you want to stick in a paper without, but not being able to. And basically, what I'm doing is just pulling up the list of covariates really quickly. Generally speaking, the big things were like what type of pattern of work were you at, like full-time, part-time? People who were retired had more opportunity to volunteer, generally speaking. And there's also a thing too where it depends on if it's informal volunteering, women are more likely to volunteer. Or people identifying as female, or to be specific, people identifying as female are more likely to volunteer. And as age goes up, people are more likely to devote more time to volunteering. We didn't look at health, but like you had kind of alluded to, health and religion, they're kind of bound in ways that are perhaps like you can't really parse them out. So just to kind of expand on what Ryan was saying, in case people are in the chat and I'm not really sure, If you go to church all the time, you're well enough to go to church all the time. So nobody who is invalid or like otherwise unable to move goes to church on a regular basis. So if you correlated religious attendance with like physical wellness, you're going to find like to be charitable, a small correlation between those two variables. It's not very impressive, but this doesn't necessarily mean that like going to church makes you healthy. You're kind of selecting on the outcome variable here because the only people who can go to church all the time will also be healthy. Like no one's invalided and going to church all the time. It just doesn't make sense. Now there's variation, but like again, the relationships aren't large to begin with. In terms of variability accounted for, like you're not talking a huge amount, to be honest. I'm just like going through the R squareds and the original table. Covariates were accounting for about 4% of the relationship. The R squared for like the addition of like religious predictors, they're really only adding like a fraction of percent. And this is pretty par for the course for a lot of volunteering stuff. The models, they didn't release pseudo R squareds because of survey weighting. But it's only a small percentage. One of the issues too, sorry, I'm going to totally ruin the vibe of this very like easy to follow mellow conversation by talking about numbers for a minute. One of the issues with using R squared is that because atheists are really, really, really small as a group generally, like compared to the other like 15,000 people, even if you do find really, really big differences with atheists, those aren't going to manifest in the R squared estimate really well because they're making up such a small proportion of the group. It's actually an issue I encountered with my dissertation repeatedly because the everything was significant, but the like variance explained was so small because the atheist group is so small. All right, that's my vibe killing mood thing over.
That was great. Thank you, David. There is a question by Hannah in the chat. I am wondering how broader economic factors might impact volunteering. Thinking about how giving time freely is a privilege, did you notice any similarities or differences between religious and atheist volunteers with respect to their economic position in society?
Penny, do you want to do this or do you want me to do it?
I want you to do that because I just closed my browser window that had our article, so I don't remember. I can't find the table real quickly.
No, that's okay. So there was some relationship in terms of like your working ability or like what type of what level of employment status you had. Generally though, and like you kind of hit it on its head, it's kind of about privilege. So I've got, just as like kind of like an anecdotal thing, I've got kids, love my kids, but they are time vampires. Every single second I have that's not about work or cleaning the house, which is mostly a mess made by them, I'm driving them to hockey or driving them to soccer or sitting through some sort of like presentation that they've done using Among Us characters for some reason. I'm not really sure, but there is a huge amount of time that I don't get to do other things with because I'm devoting it to my children. One of the more consistent types of covariate significance we saw is when people were retired, I think, and were particularly old. Then you see this kind of increase in volunteerism. People who are wealthier tended to volunteer more, although the effect was like small, which again makes sense. If I'm like in poverty and my kid comes home like Dad, I'm do you want to volunteer this Saturday to make baked goods? I'd be like, well, no, I've got to work my like 9th job because like we're in poverty. So this makes sense, like that there is absolutely a degree of privilege. There's also some regional variations as well. Compared to the Atlantic provinces, that's where I'm from, people from Quebec and people from Ontario were less likely to volunteer. People from like the prairies, which would be kind of like the Midwest kind of conceptually, they would be more likely to volunteer. So, or they'd be as equally likely to volunteer. So there's a kind of in like kind of a macro perspective, there's kind of a I think it's the sociological term is like Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. It's like organizations or like provinces that are more rural or more like less like densely like metropolitan. They're more likely to have a higher rate of volunteering than than provinces that are like more densely metropolitan, like Toronto in Ontario or like Montreal, Quebec.
Well, and that may well have to do with density of opportunities as well, but but also with the fact that you don't have, in rural communities, often, any services that are going to be provided are going to be organized by or facilitated by volunteers. right?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. This is a tricky thing trying to do because Canada especially has we have very built up areas, but we also have a lot of area in between that just very rural.
yeah.
Great, thank you. Is there any other question or comment? Or something, David and Penny, do you want to add to the conversation?
I really enjoyed working on the project. This was my first like partnership with Penny, and she was great. I emailed her out of the blue saying, "Hey, Dr. Edgell, my name's David. I do research. Do you want to do research with me?" And Penny was great about it. She didn't want to go, and she's like, "Yeah, that sounds cool. I won't be able to do anything for 6 months. Is that okay?" I'm like, "That's totally cool. Like, we'll chat about this later." But it was she was absolutely terrific to work with.
Well, thank you. You were as well. I would be totally interested in doing, and I have some ideas for pursuing this topic some more as well. So let's circle back.
I'll ignore my kids for another few years.
We used to say call me, but let's Zoom or something. Yeah,
That's
I think it was really great. And well, and it was fun. I mean, I've when I first started doing my research, you kind of go off and do your own dissertation. And it's like, and ever since then, I have really, really oriented toward more collaborative projects. I think that I just think the research is better. I think it's a lot more fun. And I think the research is better. I think people bring different skills and they bring, I mean, in your case, access to data that I wouldn't have been able to access or wouldn't have known what to do with. And so it was really good. But I also liked talking with David and working with David because I think you, like me, have a sense of, you really approach this sociologically, and you have a sense of the complexity of the factors that shape volunteering as a social embedded activity, right? So it's different in small towns and rural areas. It's different depending on, what kinds of communities you're embedded in. It's different, like there are different factors that both, again, the individual brings things to the context, but the context itself varies. And I think that, so I like that. I strongly push against explanations for, I think psychology is real, but I strongly push against explanations for complex social behavior in context that rely too heavily on, oh, there's just one single belief and everyone who holds it does the same thing, or that just strikes me as so simple-minded. It's frustrating for me. So I felt like we were compatible too. I did not say that, Ryan. And good psychological research isn't like that. But there's a lot of there's a lot of armchair psychologizing about people's motives and beliefs and how they straightforwardly translate into the same kind of behavior in a variety of contexts. And I just don't buy it. So I felt like we were compatible that way too.
Yeah, again, terrific to work with. And as a social psychologist who's ego is just taking a battering at this moment. I think that
social psychologist.
We can't overlook the environmental milieu that someone is in to predict whether or not they're going to be doing specific things. Extroversion matters, sure. Openness matters, sure. Right. But is there an organization you can volunteer with? That kind of matters a lot too. Right. Nathan, you had a question? Apparently I said as a moderator for the conversation now.
It's okay, it's perfect.
No, it was more just to kind of follow up on the earlier discussion about different locations and having kind of different kind of resources. I think whether if it's about homelessness or something, like whether a city has the kind of resources to look after itself, or whether this is kind of done through volunteering. But I think maybe you kind of addressed it already.
I think it depends on part of the perceived need and whether or not the organization exists. I think I'm in New Brunswick. I moved to New Brunswick in 2017. One of the first things I did is I looked for an active secular group because I'm like, I haven't been part of a secular community before, and there just really wasn't anything there. There's religion's kind of less in the public sphere than say in the United States, and as a consequence, I think secularists. My hypothesis, and Penny, please feel free to jump in and yell at me. My hypothesis is that secularism will emerge as a reaction to a very strong religious
You're right.
aspect.
Yes! And there's research on that. You were right. There's research on that. I
don't need
didn't
to
do
research.
it,
I
and
had an idea.
but yes,
Perfect.
there is. Yeah.
But I think but because religion's not in the public sphere as much in Canada, although it still is to a troubling extent, we can get into that. I think as a consequence, there's fewer secularist groups unless it's in a very built up area like Toronto has. I think Sunday Assembly, they have a few different like secular organizations. There are good secular organizations in Canada, but I think like the pushback isn't as required because religion is playing like a more muted role in
Well, and I think that we tend to talk again I think it's survey research pushes us to do this. We tend to talk in these uniform ways. So we say things like there's less stigma in being an atheist now, and that's absolutely true as an aggregate measure at the societal level. It may or may not be true in a small town where
that's fair.
So there's that too. I mean, because we tried for a focus group study this was 2017, so a while ago now. We tried to find rural atheist or secular or humanist organizations in Minnesota. But literally, we just wanted to like get their members together and do a focus group. This was like one focus group, and we tried several rural counties around the Twin Cities. We found plenty of organized atheism and secularism and humanism in the Twin Cities, and even in the suburbs. We couldn't, like, there was no group with which to hold a focus group. So it's hard to,
yeah. No, I believe it. When I first met my wife, well, she wasn't my wife then, she was my girlfriend, but she would become my wife eventually. You invariably talk about religion as just part of like a natural type of progression in that like relationship. And she identified as Anglican, which I was like, cool. And she asked like what I was. I'm like, well, like I'm an atheist. And she had a blank look. And I was like, do you know what that means? She's like, does that mean like you worship Satan or something? And I'm like, well, no, that's not what atheism is. But like this is her, like, and she came from very, very rural Newfoundland. Like we're talking like 3 hours away. There's a ferry ride in the middle to get to anything more than a few thousand people, like for like very, very rural. But this was her exposure to what atheism was. Is just atheism and are the same thing as Satanists, which is still the funniest thing she's ever like said.
Yeah.
That was a great story. So thank you again, David and Penny. It was a super interesting presentation and discussion. Thank you everyone for being here today. So I will leave Nathan to give some announcement, then we can finish this Meet the Author. So Nathan, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks again, David and Penny. Really great
thanks for the invitation. This was fun.
I just wanted to give a plug for our next Meet the Author coming up in a few weeks with Nadia Bider on religious residue, the impact of childhood religious socialization on the religiosity of nuns in France, Germany, Great Britain, and Sweden. So I included the link for the registration for that. I also wanted to mention this podcast the NCF is doing. We've just released our 4th episode on the environment. So check that out. And I also included a link for our mailing list in case anyone's not signed up for it. Yeah. So yeah, thanks again to the presenters and everyone who attended. It was really interesting discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great week.